I'm Indy Neidell, and this is Out of the Foxholes, where I sit here longing for my chair of infinite knowledge, which is right behind me, just out of reach, and answer all your questions about the Second World War. Just a reminder, Time Ghost Army members get prioritized or even guaranteed answers. More on that at the end. Our first question is from Time Ghost Army Captain Thangler. He writes, "Good day, Indy, and the rest of Time Ghost." Yes, all of it. All of us. That's all of us, okay? My grandmother, not mine, Thangler's, lived through the Nazi occupation of Norway. One day, she was walking home and had dropped her groceries. An SS man came by to help pick them up, and she kicked the groceries out of his hands. She would rather risk death than be helped by a member of the SS. To honor that, I'd like to ask, what was likely in her bag? What was rationing and buying groceries in general like in Norway? My grandmother said she was diagnosed with, quote, weak nerves, so I'd like to know more about the food-related stresses she was under. I doubt you could find out what personal stresses she went through. Yeah, probably not. Cheers, and thanks for all your history coverage, I guess. Okay, well, thank you too, Thangler. Like you said, I cannot claim to be able to tell you what your grandmother or anyone else went through individually. I can give you some general information about how she and others would have experienced food rationing in Norway. Okay, so in terms of food supplies, there were shortages of pretty much everything, and accessing the food that was available, yeah, it became more time-consuming. But unlike in, say, the Soviet Union, Greece, or the Netherlands, Norway never experienced anything close to starvation. The numbers vary, but if you count the food available through rationing, foraging from the land, purchasing on the black market, however people got their hands on it, Norwegians were able to consume somewhere in the region of 2,000 to 2,800 calories per day. Overall, this was more than France or Italy, and was about the same as Britain and Germany for most of the war. The amount of food that someone was entitled to varied depending on age. Manual laborers, farm laborers, those with medical conditions, pregnant women, and new mothers were all allocated higher rations. Smaller children obviously got less. Of course, German soldiers stationed in Norway and the families of Norwegians fighting in the German forces all got more food, all got better food. During the operation, Forsyningsdepartementet, or the Ministry of Supply, was in charge of the food supply. There were three main methods by which food was rationed and distributed. The first included things like bread, sugar, potatoes, and coffee, for which the authorities specified how much a person was allowed each month. For these, you got a ration book, which the shops would stamp when you bought whatever you were entitled to. The second category included meats and milk and vegetables, and for these items, deliveries were a little more difficult to predict. So customers had to register with their local shops, which were then responsible for selling the foodstuffs in fair shares. Finally, there was a third category for irregular deliveries of things like canned goods or candy and sweets, right? When these goods arrived, the authorities would make an announcement, and Norwegians could then use sets of extra ration cards to purchase the relevant goods from the shops. If this all sounds a bit complicated, that's only because it was. It put a lot of strain on the women of Norway. Here's a report from 1943 describing an experience which was probably pretty familiar for women across much of Europe during the war. Being a housewife in Norway today is a demanding and almost impossible task. Half the day is spent queuing. First, she must get out early in the morning to get a queue number for the fish. Then later in the day, when the fish comes in, she has to get back and stand in the queue to pick it up. This happens every day. It often happens that there is no fish left in the shop where you are registered, and then there is no other option than to travel to the city center and go from shop to shop in the hope of getting something to mix with the potatoes for dinner. As well as spending more time queuing, the women of Norway also had to get creative with their cooking. New recipes were published in books and magazines or just passed around on notepaper. They detailed things like how to make jam with as little sugar as possible, how best to use the rutabaga, or swede, and how to make the Norwegian national dish fårikål with dried herring instead of lamb. One recipe that went around was for an almond cake without any actual almonds. Instead of flour, it used boiled crushed potatoes, oatmeal, sugar, and margarine, plus a few drops of almond essence. The authorities also encouraged people to use whatever they could get their hands on, whether collecting berries and wild plants, using fish roe, eating wild seabirds, making sausages out of the heads and the organs of animals. Despite this extra hardship, people apparently quite appreciated the rationing, or at least it was better than the alternatives. Forsyningsdepartementet may have been under German control, but the Norwegians believed that it did its best to stick up for them. And having a well-functioning rationing system reduced the power and the allure of the black market and its massively inflated prices. Our next question is from Nick Macarius, a member of the Time Ghost Army 4344 Division. He asks, "Hi, Indian gang. I've been watching your series since you started the Great War Channel." Well, that's nearly 10 years. "I appreciate all the hard work you do to make this amazing historical content. I don't think it has been mentioned yet on this channel, but here is my question. I read in William Shirer's book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, that Hans Thomson, German ambassador to Washington, was heavily involved in influencing U.S. Congress members, more specifically the America First Committee, to keep America neutral in the early years of war. Even saying in a diplomatic cable to Berlin, 'We will spend every mark available to keep America out of the war!' Would you be able to elaborate more on this subject?" Okay, Nick, nice to hear from people who've been here since the very start. I assume you'll come with us when we head over to Korea next month. As to your question, interestingly enough, Hans Thomson wasn't actually the ambassador to the United States. That was Hans Heinrich Diekhoff. But the Germans recalled him to Berlin in November 1938. They did that in retaliation for the Americans recalling their ambassador to Germany in protest after Kristallnacht. Thomson was charge d'affaires, the acting head of the diplomatic mission while there's no ambassador. And he stayed on in America until Germany declared war in December 1941. As early as May 1939, Thomson was warning Berlin that he believed President Roosevelt would eventually win the battle against the congressional isolationists, and that, in the case of war between Britain and Germany, Roosevelt's sympathies would lie firmly with Britain. In a cable to Berlin, he referred dramatically to the president's unbridled hatred of the totalitarian powers. Shortly after the German invasion of Poland, he followed this by warning that the sympathies of the overwhelming majority of the American people are with our enemies, and America is convinced of Germany's war guilt. With a pretty clear-eyed assessment of the way things were heading, Thomson set out to buy as much time for Germany as possible. The first element of Thomson's strategy was to try and prevent overzealous elements in Berlin from excessively antagonizing the Americans. In May 1940, he urged the Foreign Office to restrain German military intelligence from sending over sabotage agents to America, writing, "I have learned that a German-American, von Hausberger, and a German citizen, Walter, both of New York, are alleged to be planning acts of sabotage against the American armament industry by direction of the German Abwehr. This activity is the surest way to bring America actively to the side of our enemies and to destroy the last remaining sympathies for Germany." But the tide was turning. And by June 1940, in the wake of the German conquest of the Low Countries and the invasion of France, Thomson wired Berlin that intervention hysteria was stirring in the United States. The second element of Thomson's strategy was to support isolationist sentiment in the United States. Thomson didn't really care where this sentiment came from, and most of the people he supported were not necessarily pro-German or pro-Nazi, simply against American involvement in the war. In the summer of 1940, he set his sights on influencing the Republican National Convention into choosing an isolationist candidate for president. To that end, he asked Berlin for $3,000 to support an unnamed Republican congressman and about 50 isolationist members of the party. He also requested somewhere in the range of $30,000 to $40,000 to cover half the cost of an advertising campaign, urging the convention to keep America out of the war on behalf of that same Republican. In July 1940, the German envoy in Mexico cabled Berlin that about $160,000 had been given to like 40 Pennsylvania Democrats. Like I said, the Germans didn't care which side of the aisle the isolationists came from. This was in an attempt to persuade them to vote against Roosevelt's renomination as presidential candidate and also against the re-election of an anti-isolationist senator. More broadly, embassy funds were also used to support the publishing of books favorable to the isolationist cause and to distribute copies of the speeches of Republican Representative Hamilton Fish, former Democratic Senator Rush Holt, and aviation pioneer Charles Lindbergh. Fish was the chairman of the National Committee to Keep America Out of Foreign Wars, and Holt and Lindbergh were both leading members and speakers of the America First Committee. Some of the people who benefited from German money and support were aware of the connection, but others like Fish were completely unaware that their works were being promoted by Germany. For his part, Lindbergh swung fully behind the war as soon as Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States. The exact details of Thompson's effort should be taken with a grain of salt. We know the sums of money Thompson was requesting, but we don't know how much Berlin actually ended up sending. And of course, there are no receipts or records relating to the actual payments to Americans. There's also a chance that Thompson deliberately inflated his own connections and influence in America. Nonetheless, Gerhard Weinberg, whose work I've used frequently for my coverage of the war, assessed the campaign as such. It was at the time the most extensive foreign intervention, direct intervention, ever into an American election campaign. If you want to know more about this period, we actually have a whole video on the America First Committee, which covers the growth and the demise of the isolationist cause. Okay. Rommel is much talked about as the best general on the Axis side, but is it possible he would have conducted operations in the East better than other Axis generals? This is an interesting question. When we're talking about Rommel, we're talking about an exceptionally skilled leader, one whom some would consider to be the finest tank commander of the war. His reputation was enhanced greatly by his exploits in France in 1940 and his strong performance in North Africa after that. I can see why people would think he'd thrive on the Eastern Front as well, since we're talking about a lot of wide open spaces with plenty of room to maneuver and to outflank, similar to Northern France and North Africa, but dialed up to 11. But here's where I'm going to have to disappoint some of you and say he probably would not have made much of a difference in the East. First of all, it's not like the Germans lacked aggressive and competent tank commanders in the East, like Hermann Hoth, and even Heinz Guderian himself, who literally wrote the book on tanks, to name a couple. Rather, the reasons why Blitzkrieg ultimately failed in the East are more complex than simple failures of command. In France, the Germans were able to make use of captured fuel stocks or just gas stations to fill the tanks and keep the panzers rolling. I've talked about that before. But in the Soviet Union, this would not have been possible. Soviet fuel had a different octane from German fuel and had to be treated before it could be used. So German tank divisions in the East had to rely on their own fuel reserves and the German supply network to keep up the advance. During the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa, this obviously was not too much of a problem. Fuel dumps were pre-prepared, loads of trucks were available to transport it, and the distances were not that extreme. So we saw some very effective armored thrusts and gigantic encirclements. The problem was, the deeper into the USSR the Germans pushed, the more these supplies became an issue. Railways needed conversion from the larger Russian gauge to the smaller German gauge, and the comparatively poor road infrastructure hindered the ability of trucks to supply armor. So you might argue that Rommel would fall victim to the same supply conundrum that plagued him in North Africa, often able to achieve tactical success, but becoming too overextended to take advantage of this in a truly meaningful way. There are other concerns to consider, like the freezing winters, but perhaps more crippling to a panzer leader, the Rasputitsa, the spring and autumn mud. The Eastern Front was also under much greater scrutiny from German military and political leadership than North Africa was. So Rommel would have invariably found himself having to deal with interference directly from Hitler on top of the logistical nightmare of invading the USSR in the first place. Overall, I'd say this would have added up to Rommel, well, acquitting himself well if called upon, but unable to make a really decisive difference. Of course, there is always room for disagreement and discussion on questions like this, so let's hear what you think in the comments below. And that is it for today's Out of the Foxhole video. Norwegian housewives, German ambassadors, and Erwin Rommel. Can you imagine all of them in the same room at the same time? All of them dining on reindeer and gravlax on a boat in a Norwegian fjord. Everybody take a sec. Astrid, take a second to picture this. Okay, it's a good picture. Rommel, a couple Norwegian housewives, Thompson, Charles Lindbergh, Roosevelt standing proudly, not in his wheelchair. I could go on all day. I'll end the episode. Okay, if you have a question to ask, right, go to community.timeghost.tv, or better yet, join the Time Ghost Army at patreon.com or at timeghost.tv. It is thanks to the Time Ghost Army that we can keep on doing what we do, and if you subscribe at captain level or above, you'll get a guaranteed answer to your question. With our new series on the Korean War and the rise of Hitler coming soon, there has never been a better time to join, both for you and for us. And one more thing, whatever you do, do not leave your questions below this video. We will not answer those. We won't. We will just ignore them. And you will be left waiting around like you're queuing up for rations in 1943. But not in Norway. You're queuing up somewhere like in Greece where there wasn't any food. Okay? See you next time.